From the Chesapeake Bay Journal, your source for independent environmental reporting, this is Chesapeake Uncharted, the podcast that uncovers stories about the bay, its interconnected ecosystem, and the people who rely on them. I'm Jeremy Cox. On today's episode... Well, that was quick. We found the water real fast here.
Yeah, and we're approaching low tide, so this is, in theory, going down, although it's up to your middle of the foot, and it looks like here we're going to be up to our knees here in a second. So,
it's just another day in the Larchmont Edgewater neighborhood in Norfolk, Virginia. Another day when the water has overflowed the banks of the Lafayette River and flooded the residential streets. I'm sloshing through a foot of water here, soon to be 2 feet. With me is Michael Allen, a climate scientist with Old Dominion University. As we're walking, the remnants of Hurricane Sally are churning away just offshore, and its counterclockwise motion is pushing water from the Chesapeake Bay up into these backwaters, Allen tells me.
While we think of flooding as something that is often associated with a hurricane or a heavy rain bomb, for instance, a lot of what we're seeing this weekend is just going to be a function of wind.
Allen came to Southeast Virginia in 2014. He knew it was one of the most at-risk regions in the country for sea level rise. But even he was surprised by how often the floods washed in.
So when I moved here, I thought this was just ridiculous. And now being here for 6 years, it's somewhat normal in some weird fashion.
The water has this corrosive effect on the psyche, to be sure, but also on infrastructure. Allen takes me deeper into the neighborhood. The road curves where it meets the river, only the asphalt has disappeared beneath the water, and you can see how the frequent flooding has taken a toll on the road.
You can see these waves and you hear that slapping water that's hitting the asphalt and concrete, and literally it's eroding it. So you can see some of the chunks of the road that have just been washed away. Maybe not with this storm, but over time, and you don't know where the river is. We are in the river. The river has breached the banks.
During this season of Chesapeake Uncharted, we're examining climate change. It's happening in the here and now, and not just at the North Pole and Antarctica. We're talking right here in the Chesapeake Bay region. With each episode, we're taking a close look at one slice of this new reality. Think of this as a snapshot in time before things get worse, when we as a society can maybe still change the future. Today, we present the second of a two-part look at infrastructure. In our last episode, we looked at how communities are responding to climate change around the bay. We saw how some places are undertaking expensive investments to defend themselves from rising water and more powerful storms. But we heard that there are other ways to make coastal communities more resilient. Today, we'll look at alternatives to big construction projects. We'll explore green solutions to rising waters and examine some policies that may lay the groundwork for a safer future. We'll get into that right after this break.
Chesapeake Uncharted is brought to you in part by Greenfin Studio, offering marketing and communications services for a greener world. Their team combines strategy, creativity, and scientific insight, setting them apart when conservation, sustainability, and scientific organizations need help telling their stories. See what they can do for you at greenfinstudio.com.
Welcome back. On today's episode of Chesapeake Uncharted, we're diving deeper into our discussion on infrastructure. This time, we're going to turn our spotlight on greener fixes and regulatory changes. We'll pick up where we left off in the Larchmont Edgewater neighborhood. Michael Allen, the local climate scientist, is leading me through knee-deep water in the middle of the street when I see something out of the corner of my eye. A woman and a young girl are struggling to get a kayak underway in the floodwater at the base of a driveway. The girl attempts a few paddle strokes, but it's just not happening. They'd just given in when I wandered up. Brought the kayak out, but was it a little too shallow or something?
It is right now. We should have came out earlier. The tide is going down, but it's supposed to be up to, I think, 6 feet tomorrow. So this will be completely covered, and we'll have to take the car in because the whole front yard will be covered.
The woman turns out to be Stephanie Lauer. She's the nanny to the girl, whose name is Isla Wellman. Isla tells me she's 10 years old. As a dad to a young girl myself, I could only imagine what it would be like to grow up around all this unpredictable water. So I put the question to Isla. What's it like to have your street flood like this? Is it just kind of like
It's kind of fun just to go out here and like kayak and paddleboard and walk in the water. Me and my brother will just like play around in the water when it rains.
make the best of it?
Yeah.
What's your favorite thing to do?
Probably kayak or paddleboard.
Do you ever see fish out here?
Yeah, we fish here.
On the street, though?
Nah.
Okay.
We'll see minnows, but not like big fish.
Okay, all right. So, basically a magical childhood. Well, maybe not all the time. Isla has dim memories of when the house used to flood, too. Her family had to replace the wooden floor twice before they finally said no more. In 2016, they got the house raised a full story to keep the water from coming back in. They're not alone. It seemed like every fourth or fifth house in the neighborhood had been elevated. It certainly keeps your stuff dry, but it doesn't do anything to keep the water off the roads. Some days, Lauer told me, the mailman skips the house because it's just too wet.
Besides that, just parking situation. Every day we have to look what the tide's going to be to know where we can park.
Although there was plenty of room in the driveway, Lauer opted today to park at the library around the corner to keep her car dry. Her plight illustrated a point that Alan had made earlier in the day as we stood in floodwater in front of another elevated home.
Getting to this home, again, the water's up halfway up your leg, even more so, probably even more if you take a step left, it's up to your knee. And so you think of how low a car is, a car's not going to get through here without stalling out.
Among these stately Tudor-style homes just north of downtown Norfolk, you can watch these small climate change dramas playing out. Like, can I drive down this street?
Oh, here comes a gentleman in the car. I don't know where he's going. That water's up to his tires. And he's likely going to turn around because he's not going to get through that, I don't think.
Yep, here he comes.
Yep, he's backing up.
I came away from my time with Alan with a strong reaction. As beautiful as those homes are, that's not how I would want to live. Can society afford to construct a solution to this neighborhood's flooding and all the other neighborhoods with flooding? Here's a reminder from our last episode of what Doug Beaver, Norfolk's own climate resilience officer, thinks about that. The context here was that the city is leading a $120 million project to save 2 neighborhoods with a mammoth breakwater, 2 pump stations, and other infrastructure. As you said, it's $120 million. This is a very large city with a lot of waterfront on it. Is it possible, is it feasible to bring this kind of level of attention and construction to all the places that need it here?
There's not enough money to do that. So there's got to be some non-structural, some nature-based solutions.
So if funding remains limited, what alternatives are there for these low-lying places plagued by frequent climate-fueled flooding? That's what we'll explore in the rest of this episode.
My name is Shauna Udvardi, and I'm a climate resilience analyst with the Union of Concerned Scientists.
In 2018, Udvardi co-authored a report for the organization. In it, the advocacy group attempted to give a picture of how much property in the United States is at risk of regular flooding in the future. And it lays out the monetary value of those properties. The paper shows estimates for 2100 based on 3 climate change scenarios. a low level of sea level rise at just 1.6 feet, intermediate where it's 4 feet, and a high scenario where greenhouse gas emissions just keep rising, and so do the seas, by nearly 7 feet. The latest climate report from the United Nations has lowered sea level rise projections somewhat in its worst case scenario. In talking to experts who have studied the new report, I learned that the water in the Chesapeake region is now expected to rise by around 3 to 4 feet by 2100. That lines up pretty well with the intermediate scenario in the report from the Union of Concerned Scientists, with a 4 feet of rise. With 4 feet of rise, more than 46,000 homes, representing $13 billion in value, would be at risk for chronic flooding in Maryland alone, according to the union's report. In Virginia, 42,000 homes with a collective value of about $11 billion would be at risk. Chronic flooding, by the way, is where tidal flooding occurs at least 26 times per year, an average of more than twice per month.
It's one of the biggest things that people are confronted with. It's one of the biggest, impacts, and along with extreme heat and wildfires we've been, seeing over the last few years.
Let's set aside for the moment the cost to upgrade all that at-risk public infrastructure, the roads that would need to be raised, the storm sewers that would be enlarged. What are we going to do about all this private property that's going to be flooding more and more? Perhaps, Udvardy suggests, there's a policy change that can help ease our transition into a climate change world. In fact, it's almost here. The first part of it goes into effect this October 1st. That's 1 week from today, if you're listening to this episode on the day it drops. And it even has an exciting name, Risk Rating 2.0.
It is sounding very wonky, but it's important for both FEMA and flood policy owners to really understand what this change means.
Since its inception 50 years ago, the National Flood Insurance Program has set flood insurance rates based largely on whether properties are either in or out of a flood zone. And now?
So what this new rating system does, it uses modeling and updated data to actually assess the scale of risk, flood risk, for each individual property based on a range of different variables, including different types of flood risks, like how close you are to a river or the coast, the value of the home, the elevation of the home, among many other variables.
Under the old system, owners of lower value homes historically have overpaid for flood insurance, effectively subsidizing the insurance for mansions on the beach, Udvardy told me.
Folks that have second homes along the coast. And so what this will do is help rectify that, in fact, injustice, right? That's where the new rating system is supposed to be taking us.
On the cost side, about 23% of homeowners nationwide are expected to pay less in premiums once the policy goes into effect, according to the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which oversees the program. But the amount can vary from place to place. In Maryland, for example, about 60% of policyholders are expected to be paying less. Only about 3% will be paying $10 or more per month than they currently do. In more hurricane-prone states, such as Texas and Florida, the role is reversed. Generally, homeowners will be paying more in those states. Now, the federal government doesn't make local land use decisions, but the federal flood insurance program is one big way it can affect policy at the local level. By getting insurance rates in line with the actual risk, Udvardy told me, the new rating system will likely spur hard but vitally important civic conversations, especially in areas where premiums are going up.
It's really going to help homeowners get a better sense of their actual risk, their actual flood risk. So this could be really good as far as educating homeowners, potential home buyers, and hopefully decision makers, people on the ground that are making land use decisions.
Some critics warn that in special flood hazard areas, where federally backed mortgage holders are required to carry flood insurance, the rising rates could depress property values. In extreme instances, frustrated owners may find themselves unable to sell their homes and simply abandon them. Udvardy hopes that government programs will help disadvantaged people afford any steep hikes, and perhaps new programs could help blunt the moving expenses for those who decide to head to drier ground.
What we really need to do is get better at moving people out of these risky areas and more importantly, not letting these risky areas get developed in the first place.
It's not a cheap solution. The federal flood program currently provides $1.3 trillion in coverage, and it owes about $20 billion to the U.S. Treasury. But at least it's a cost being borne by the federal government and not cash-strapped state and local governments. For our next story, let's stay in the policy arena, but shift over to public infrastructure. I know that doesn't sound exciting, but it's worth staying with me here because we're going to talk about a sea change in public spending, one that could make it easier for rural and low-income communities to get federal investments.
When we look at prioritizing flood risk reduction projects at a federal level, we've typically used lives lost and property values protected.
I called up Lisa Wanger, an environmental economist at the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, for insight into how the federal government has traditionally prioritized infrastructure spending.
So you can immediately see that if all we are looking at is value of the properties, there will be a tendency to protect, high value homes more than low value homes, even though an equal number of people might be affected.
But changes are in the works that could upend the way that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has decided which projects get money. Under the 2020 Water Resources Development Act, Congress directed the Army Corps to develop a new system that considers the benefits to, among other things, environmental quality and other elements of society.
Theoretically, it's always been possible to use an equity weight on populations. It's just rarely done because you can imagine people feel uncomfortable deciding who should count more, right? But we now have a lot of research about which communities tend to have excess harms as a result of experiencing flooding. And part of this has to do with a lot of research that was instigated after Hurricane Katrina, when we all became a lot more aware of the inequities of flood risk.
Wanger has been in the middle of the discussion. Last year, she co-authored, on behalf of the Army Corps, a guide for basing construction decisions on the environmental good those projects can perform. Instead of considering merely the value of real estate, her team's proposal puts into real dollars the value of, say, preserving a tree canopy or sequestering more carbon in the ground. Wanger shared with me a memo from January signed by Ricky James, at the time the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works. In the 7-page letter, James outlines a new cost-benefit framework. It calls for officials to consider total benefits of project alternatives, including, quote, equal consideration of economic, environmental, and social categories. But the guidance gives review teams a lot of leeway to implement it as they see fit, Wanger cautioned. And in July, after taking public comment on a host of Army Corps policies, the Biden administration indicated that the cost-benefit implementation section would likely require more rulemaking before going into effect. So, stay tuned. For our last section today, we'll consider a redefinition of infrastructure. For decades, it has been the business of gray things. Roads, gutters, seawalls, culverts, stuff made out of concrete. Increasingly, the public sector has green on its mind instead. We'll talk about that right after this last break.
This is Laura Lutz, editor at the Chesapeake Bay Journal. I hope you're enjoying our podcast, and I'd like to invite you to join the community of Bay Journal readers. If you care about climate change, wildlife, clean air, healthy communities, and of course the Bay and its rivers, you'll find news you can use at the Bay Journal, along with some great ideas for outdoor travel. Our subscriptions are free. Check us out at bayjournal.com and click on subscribe to start receiving the best independent environmental news in the Bay region.
Hello again. Today on Chesapeake Uncharted, we're winding up our two-part series on the intersection of climate change and infrastructure. To be effective, infrastructure doesn't have to be gray. Why don't we go over and check this out?
Sure.
What's going on here?
Yeah. So over here we have one of our dump trucks on site with our contractors, and they are unloading some soil and some other materials onto the edge of the project by the water.
I've traveled to the shores of the West River, south of Annapolis, to get a glimpse of green infrastructure going into the ground. It sounds like a typical construction site. The beeping, the offloading of stones, the on and off roar of diesel engines. But I assure you, it looks different. Here, contractors are removing a wooden bulkhead and stone riprap along 885 feet of the riverfront. Laura Todd of the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay helped make the project a reality.
Those hardened shorelines, when a wave hits that, it's really just pushing the wave energy back. It's not kind of taking it in stride. It's not a natural approach of how a wave would normally interact with the shoreline.
Replacing it will be plants, sand, and rock, Todd tells me. You know, the stuff more typically found in nature. Hence the name, a living shoreline. When it's complete, the waves won't be so violent here.
So by removing a lot of those hardened structures and taking a more natural approach, when a wave is going to hit the shoreline, it's going to dissipate that energy a lot more across a larger area and lessen the effects of it, as opposed to stronger and higher waves coming and hitting the same areas over and over again that you'd see in a hardened shoreline.
According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, a living shoreline can absorb about half the energy of an incoming wave. As climate change supercharges our storms, that could save a lot of property damage. The other goal here is to keep the West River from spilling onto the land. The park-like property we're standing on belongs to the United Methodist Church and operates as a summer camp. There are fishing piers, lodge buildings, a ropes course, a pool, the whole retreat vibe. Obviously, floodwater doesn't mix with that. With sea level rise and the bulkhead's deterioration, it was getting worse, Todd said.
It was even becoming a problem, even reaching some of their buildings as well. So after a big storm, having a lot of storm surge and water coming up onto the lawns, seeping into the buildings.
Right now, all I can see is a big trench where the bulkhead used to be. So Todd walks me through what it will look like in just a few short weeks.
With the living shoreline component, it's going to have a series of embayments. So it's essentially going to be creating kind of like a cove structure almost. So it's directing the water to hit in particular spots in the shoreline itself. And that's going to be paired with some marsh plantings as well. 2 species of marsh plantings, Spartina patens and Spartina intiflora, which are the typical, marsh plantings that you see in a living shoreline.
To catch floodwater, the project also includes a shallow ponded area that will be dry most of the time, except after heavy rains. The overall cost is fairly modest as far as stormwater infrastructure projects go, about $1 million. If state officials have their way, more projects like it will be following in its wake. This was one of the first resilience parts.
So this project is the first project going in the ground for the Maryland Department of Natural Resources Resiliency Through Restoration Initiative. And they have a portfolio of a little over 15 projects, but this is the first to break ground.
With each project, the Hogan administration is looking to demonstrate, quote, smart solutions to flooding and climate impacts. Through regulations and incentives, Maryland has become one of the leaders in living shorelines. Since 2008, the state has required waterfront property owners to employ natural solutions to thwart erosion unless they can prove such methods won't work for their property. To help fund living shorelines over its lifetime, the program has handed out $3 million in loans, leading to the creation of about 40 miles of softened shoreline. But here's the thing, that's a drop in the bucket compared with the 1,000 miles of hardened shore that's already been constructed across the state. That number is worrisome, particularly as climate change takes hold. Back in our episode called Ghosts in the Forest, we looked at how Chesapeake Bay marshes are going underwater at an alarming rate. We learned that some bird species that depend on the marsh have seen their numbers crash, but we didn't really consider the marsh for what it means to humans as green infrastructure. Let's do that now.
With sea level rise, when land use changes, so we don't have as many wetlands, we have a loss of wetlands, then we've lost that protective service that those wetlands provided.
Okay, so I really dig talking to researchers like Margaret Walls, but sometimes you have to unpack what they're saying. She's a senior fellow and economist at Resources for the Future, an environmental think tank in Washington, D.C. What she's basically doing here is assigning wetlands, or marshes, a role, and that role is to protect us from storm surges during hurricanes. And if we fail to protect those marshes, well, we're in for trouble. Working with a couple of civil engineering experts at George Mason University, Walls did this study a couple years ago that struck me as a truly elegant way to express the monetary value of coastal marshes. They ran computer models depicting what would happen with various levels of sea level rise if a storm exactly like Hurricane Isabel were to hit again in the Chesapeake region. Then, they added one more variable: marsh loss.
Because of sea level rise and because of fewer wetlands on the landscape, it causes more damage. More area gets flooded, more properties get damaged, more people get affected.
Accounting just for the impacts of a 2-foot rise in sea level by 2100, an Isabel-like storm would inflict about $1.4 billion in residential damage, their calculations suggest. But if you take away those protective services of the marshland, the butcher's bill soars to $2.5 billion. So let's do the math. In a big storm, marshes could save us about $1 billion. Still think marshes don't count as infrastructure? Like other experts, Walls is confident that deep-pocketed population centers are going to find the means to protect themselves and their infrastructure from sea level rise. But what about poor rural counties? She's not so sure there.
We're going to protect cities where we've invested a lot of infrastructure and development, and Annapolis is one of them. Making these changes is really hard. It's hard. What are you going to do about Somerset County?
Good question. Somerset is a Maryland county on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay, bordering Virginia. And much of it lies just a few feet above sea level. According to one projection, the waterfront town of Crisfield will face chronic flooding over more than half its land within 20 years. About 2,500 people live in Crisfield. About 1 in 3 of them lives in poverty. It's this perfect storm of high climate change risks and low resources to combat it. Crisfield is 1 county away from where I live, so it was easy for me to check in on a long-awaited stormwater fix in the city. Kevin Wooster with the city's Public Works Department was kind enough to take a break from mowing some roadside swales to talk to me about it.
When you get on this side of town, we call it Jersey. And this is Summers Cove behind us. Down here we have the condos, we have a seafood business, community called Hammock Point.
The problem was that one of the 2 culverts under the road we're standing on had collapsed, and the roadbed was eroding. The inlet, when functioning normally, is like an escape valve for the 450-slip marina behind us. By the time I arrived, the repair was freshly installed, with a pair of 3-foot diameter pipes easily handling the comings and goings of the tide.
We have a good tidal flow now, and it can ebb and flow, and hopefully it should help with some issues in town because our drainage should be better.
Oh, this will help upstream as well?
Yes, yes.
Tell me about that.
A lot of things in this particular part of Crisfield, they drain towards Summers Cove. And with this being open, all the water, the places that drain into Summers Cove, this will be a help because we got a good flow now.
Okay. Would it help like at the apartments over there?
Yes.
Oh, that would be huge.
Yep, absolutely, yep.
Those apartments would be the public housing complex known as the Summers Cove Apartments. In 2012, during Superstorm Sandy, 270 of the complex's 330 apartments were damaged by storm surge. If this humble $82,000 culvert project could help reduce flooding there, that would be a big deal. Last year, Somerset County completed a plan to address chronic flooding. The word green makes two appearances in it, once to the repetitive flooding on Green Road, and the second time is in a recommendation. Quote, consider green infrastructure options, it says, rather than conventional stormwater solutions, end quote. In Crisfield, that's not quite happening yet. The culvert project is part of a larger drainage overhaul that involves installing 11 tide gates and 2 pump stations. The city received a $1.2 million grant from FEMA late last year to cover 90% of the construction cost. Before I let Wooster get back to work, I had one more question for him. Being in a rural place, trying to tackle these kinds of big issues, what kind of challenges does that pose?
Well, things we make out pretty good. We kind of work within our means. When things pop up, we repair things we can. We have local contractors that help us. Myself and my guys, when we see things going on, we report to City Hall and you know, we try to make repairs. I mean, it is a little bit of a challenge, but we handle it pretty well sometimes.
Thanks to Greenfin Studio, which combines creativity and communication savvy with scientific insight. Visit greenfinstudio.com to see how they can help your organization engage a wider audience. Chesapeake Uncharted is brought to you by the Bay Journal, your source for independent environmental news in the Chesapeake region. Production for this episode was by me, Jeremy Cox. The story was edited by Laura Lutz. Our marketing and advertising director is Jackie Kane. You can find more episodes of Chesapeake Uncharted on your favorite streaming service or at ChesapeakeUncharted.com. If you like what you're hearing, sign up for a free Bay Journal news subscription at BayJournal.com. Until next time, this has been Jeremy Cox. Take care.